A millionaire CEO found a little girl, barefoot and abandoned. His life changed forever. The city had settled into a late-night hush, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Streetlights stood like sentinels, casting long puddles of yellow across the asphalt. Ethan Blake drove through those empty streets with the practiced calm of a man who had stopped noticing small things. His reflection in the car window looked like all the portraits he had ever been painted into. Sharp-jawed, composed, untouchable. Inside the car, the memory of the boardroom still clung to him. Arguments, projections, the crisp clack of a final decision. Work had a rhythm that kept him steady, a mechanism he used to drown out quieter questions. At 38, his reputation as a decisive, sometimes ruthless CEO had become a shield he rarely lowered. The engine hummed beneath his feet, a small, steady comfort in the vastness of his life. He guided the car into an almost deserted parking lot, the lines on the asphalt like the bars of a cage. He had intended only to pass through, to make his way home to the mansion that felt more like a boardroom after dark. Then, as if the night itself had decided to show him something he had avoided, his headlights found a small bundle against a lamppost. For a moment, Ethan thought it was debris, a discarded coat, something unimportant. The closer the car came, the more impossible the shape seemed. Too small to be rubbish, too still to be a stray animal. He slowed, the brake light briefly painting the empty lot red, and the shape unfurled into the outline of a child. A barefoot little girl sat there, tiny and fragile against cold concrete, her knees drawn to her chest like a seashell holding a pearl. Her dress hung on her small frame, thin and pale, a child's garment dulled by dust and the long hours of being alone. Her feet rested on the rough ground, less dirty and raw, the pads of them reddened by the chill of the night. The lamppost's light haloed her head, catching loose strands of hair that fell across her forehead. She shivered not only from the cold, but from some deeper vacancy, the hollow left when someone you trust is gone. Ethan felt his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly reports. For years he had measured value in numbers. Now, measuring by breaths and small measured sobs, the scale failed him. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was so absolute it made him aware of his own heartbeat. The parking lot, for all its emptiness, felt suddenly full of questions. He watched the child for a long, awkward moment, not sure what to do with the feeling rising in his chest. The polished shoes that had walked across marble floors 1,000 times now hesitated on gravel. When he stepped out, the night air cut through his coat and reached the places money could not heat. The scent of oil and cold metal mixed with a faint sweetness, children's shampoo or soap from the little girl's hair. He moved closer, each step measured, like someone approaching an animal that might run or bite. She did not look at him at first. Her gaze was fixed upon a scuffed spot on the pavement, as if it held the answer to why she was there. Her small shoulders trembled, her hands knotting tighter around her knees, as if braiding a fortress of bone and fear. The sight of her vulnerability was an accusation that struck at him in the quietest way. He cleared his throat, looking for the words that would feel soft enough to cross the gulf between them. "Hey," he said, and the single syllable felt clumsy in his mouth. The little head lifted slowly, a hesitant movement that made him realize how cautious she had learned to be. Her eyes found his, and for a suspended instant, longer than any boardroom pause, as they locked with a depth that surprised him. There was a mixture there, ancient weariness, a spark of curiosity, and the raw edge of someone who had been abandoned. Ethan saw a flicker of recognition in those eyes, not of him, but of the possibility of help. He crouched down to her level without thinking about the symbolism or the cameras or the stories it might make. The concrete scraped his suit, and he felt absurdly exposed, like a man dressed for success suddenly stripped to a simple, awkward humanity. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question felt both inadequate and necessary. She swallowed, a tiny animal sound, and shook her head just once, a small, definitive motion. A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the lamplight and glinting like something stolen from a jewel. He searched her face for an age and settled on 7, maybe 6, because children counted differently in a world he rarely entered. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but only a thin whisper came out. "He said he'd be right back." The sentence was so ordinary and yet so impossible that it echoed in the empty space between them. Ethan pictured a man, perhaps tired, perhaps cruel, who had stood up and walked away without looking back. The idea of such ordinary cruelty made the world feel suddenly fragile, as if everything he had known could be undone. He wanted to ask who he was, whether the child had a mother, whether someone else was looking, any question that might fill the hollow of the moment. But the girl's small hands clenched tighter, and she folded inward like a bloom protecting something delicate. Her voice, when it came again, was barely audible. "I waited." He imagined the stretch of hours, the sky lightening, a sun rising she would not see, the dreary grey of loneliness extending its thumb. Ethan's hands, which had often tightened around steering wheels and pens, felt suddenly useless. The night took on a texture he had not felt in years, the grain of pavement, the scratch of gravel, the whisper of a distant siren. From the edge of the lot, a lone dog barked and then fell silent, respectful perhaps of the scene unfolding. A faint breeze moved across the girl's hair, and it sounded like an apology the world owed her. Ethan noticed small things, the ragged edge of her sleeve, the fraying at the hem, the way her collar wasn't buttoned properly. He noticed the way dirt hugged her knees, how the cold had left a rash on the tops of her feet. The practical part of him catalogued these details with clinical precision, an inventory of neglect. The other part, one he had neatly compartmentalized, felt its walls give way under a pressure that had no business with quarterly earnings. He realized, with a clarity that startled him, that this moment would not be erased by a memo or a transfer of funds. He wanted to fix it, to reorder the world so that a child did not have to be small and shivering on concrete. Yet he also knew that his desire to fix could become another shield, another way to avoid the quieter work of looking inside. He forced himself to breathe slowly, drawing in the night air as if patience were a muscle he needed to flex. The child watched him while she pulled her knees tighter, and he wondered what stories she had learned to tell herself to survive. "What's your name?" he asked, because names are anchors, and she needed to be seen as someone, not a statistic. There was a pause, a tiny negotiation, and then she said, I'm fine." The answer dissolved somewhere between defiance and protection, a default language for children who have learned to be brave. He felt a wash of helplessness at her attempt to shield him from asking further. His voice softened. He tried again. "No, your real name. Whoever you are, I want to know you." The child closed her eyes and took a breath as if that question required more courage than she was sure she had. Finally, she whispered a name that felt like a bare thing given weight by being spoken aloud. The syllables were clipped and small, and for an instant Ethan felt he had been given something precious. He stored the sound in his head, careful not to let the moment slip into the same neglect that had placed her here. He glanced around the silent lot, half expecting someone to appear, to claim her, to explain this human absence. There was no one. The lot stretched away, dotted with sleeping cars and the distant glow of a freeway. The isolation of the scene struck him like the contrast between a spotlight and an empty stage. He thought of calling someone, security, the police, a social worker, then realized that all these options had their own slowness and their own distance. He also understood that an organized response could turn a raw human moment into a procedural checkbox. For reasons he could not fully name, he bent closer and wrapped his coat around her shoulders, his movement tentative as if greeting a fragile guest. The coat was the kind carried from boardroom to ballroom, heavy and stitched with quiet confidence. Now it smelled faintly of cologne and leather, and somehow, for the moment, it felt like shelter. The child went still at the touch, but not in fear, more as if she were testing whether warmth could be trusted. She tucked her chin in and let the coat rest against her small frame like something borrowed that might become permanent. The rough fabric against her skin drew a small, involuntary shiver from her. Some sensations mapped themselves onto memory. Ethan placed his hands on the ground, steadying himself to be less imposing, trying to match the scale of his presence to her needs. He could have summoned help, but the night, this moment, felt like something he needed to inhabit fully on his own. He let the quiet sit between them, a fragile bridge of unspoken decisions. She lifted her face just enough to meet his eyes, and in the dim light they seemed very young and very old at once. The confusion and fear were there, of course, but also a glimmer of something, that could one day be trust. He felt an odd tenderness, a new and complicated emotion that pried at the edges of his armor. It was not heroism. It was simply a human response to another human's pain, immediate and undramatic. Ethan found his voice, steadier now than when he first spoke. "You don't have to be here by yourself." The statement was simple, but it felt like an offering that could change the gravity of the night. She considered the words as if weighing the truth of them, measuring whether the world had taught her to accept small mercies. A tiny laugh escaped her, half disbelief, half relief, and it sounded fragile and miraculous at once. For a flicker, the parking lot shed its anonymity and became a small stage where kindness could be tried on like a coat. He reached into his pocket and produced his phone, the screen throwing a thin rectangle of light into the dark. Instead of dialing, he shut the phone away. He wanted the moment not mediated by screens or voices that might hurry things along. The lamppost hummed overhead, indifferent and steady, as the two of them sat in a world reduced to the size of the pavement beneath them. Ethan thought of the many nights he had chosen solitude as a tactic, an armor, an unquestioned routine. He realized then that solitude had shaped him, but it did not have to define him forever. The child's fingers peeked out from the coat and toyed with the hem, a small, nervous movement seeking steadiness. He watched her profile, the small slope of her nose, the freckles at the corner of one eye that the lamplight found like constellations. Each tiny detail made her less like a story he might tell, and more like a human being who deserved attention without conditions. He felt a tightening at the base of his throat, an old thing unaccustomed to openness, and he let it pass without shame. The parking lot remained empty, but the air it seeped down. Leff felt charged by a possibility neither had expected to meet. "If you want," he said slowly, choosing words with care, "you can come with me to warm up. Just for a little while." Her eyes grew wide, surprised by the normalcy of such an offer, as if practical kindness had become foreign currency. She hesitated, 1,000 small reasons to say no running through her mind like shadows across an alley. Then, with the quiet bravery of someone who has learned to trust the rare good thing, she nodded once, barely perceptible. Ethan extended his hand, palm open, steady, an invitation without demands or conditions. Her small fingers curled into his, tentative at first, then with a grip that conveyed more than words could hold. He rose carefully, mindful of the sudden shift in scale between them, as if a balance had been quietly adjusted. For a man accustomed to orchestrating outcomes, this moment felt improvisational, raw and honest in a way that boardrooms never were. He kept his steps deliberate as they walked toward his car, not wanting to rush the fragile truce they had forged in the cold. The lamplight fell behind them, and the asphalt swallowed their shadows. Still, Ethan felt that everything that had led him here was rearranging itself. The sound of the city was distant now, like a world receding to allow something new to begin. He glanced down at the small hand in his, a weight that was less about physical mass and more about responsibility, and the sensation settled in his chest like a promise. He had no script for what came next, no predetermined resolution, only the awareness that the night had altered the geometry of his life. As they reached the car, he opened the door and paused, letting the moment stretch, aware that small decisions can tilt futures. He lifted her gently into the seat, his touch careful, as if he were handling a bird newly convinced to fly. And for the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in many years, Ethan felt something like hope begin to stir. Ethan closed the car door gently, the night air still holding the chill that seemed to press against everything around them, and as he stood there, his polished shoes clicked softly on the pavement, a sharp, almost out-of-place sound in the fragile silence of the lot, drawing the girl's eyes upward. Her small face emerged from behind the heavy folds of his coat, streaked with trails of dried and fresh tears that caught the lamplight in glistening threads. Her cheeks blotched red from cold and crying, her lips quivering as though each word she had spoken in her young life had been carved out of fear. The once pale fabric of her dress was now a canvas of dust and stains, its seams frayed, the skirt torn in places where life had clearly been careless with her, leaving marks that spoke of neglect far louder than her silence ever could. Ethan, who had closed deals worth billions with steady, unwavering confidence, found his voice softening in ways he never knew it could, and he bent down slightly, lowering himself so his eyes could meet hers without casting a shadow over her. "Where's your mom or dad?" he asked, his tone carefully woven with patience, not command, the words balanced between hope and dread, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to make his heart thud painfully in his chest. The girl's lips parted, her breath shallow and uneven, as if the very act of speaking might collapse the fragile wall she had built to survive. Then, in a whisper so faint it was nearly carried away by the night breeze, she said, "Daddy left me here. He said he's not coming back." Each syllable trembled like a bird's wing, breaking apart as they left her throat, but they reached Ethan with the weight of iron. He felt the sentence strike him, slicing through the armor he had built over years of power and pride, piercing him. In a place untouched by wealth, untouched by status, a place he had almost forgotten existed. For a man who could sign his name and change the fate of corporations, he now stood paralyzed in front of a truth so brutal in its simplicity. A child abandoned, stripped of the very anchor that should have been unshakable. The little girl's eyes flickered downward again, ashamed, as if she had done something wrong by being left behind, as if love had been something she had failed to earn, and that silent assumption, more than her words, made Ethan's chest constrict until it was hard to breathe. He watched her fingers twist at the hem of her tattered dress, the small movements betraying the storm she carried inside, and he realized she had likely repeated those words. "Daddy said he's not coming back," over and over in her head, each time hoping it would sound less real, but each time sinking deeper into its cruelty. His mind tried to find logic, to categorize, to solve, but nothing in his world of profits and losses, mergers and markets had prepared him for this kind of equation. A child who equaled nothing in the eyes of the one who should have given her everything. For a moment he closed his eyes, swallowing hard, feeling powerless in a way that humbled him completely. He opened them again, and there she was, still waiting, still clutching herself tightly, as if she were bracing for him to leave too, bracing for this stranger to echo the same cruelty she had already endured. Ethan wanted to speak, to tell her that she had done nothing wrong, that she wasn't the problem, but the words tangled on his tongue because he knew that promises from a stranger might sound fragile to a girl who had already lost the most important one. He breathed in, steadying himself, and let his voice soften again, softer than he had ever heard himself before, carrying not authority, but humanity. And though he didn't yet have the right words, his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that once nerved boardrooms, now held something new, an unspoken vow that he would not abandon her, not tonight, not now, not ever. And in that fragile, silent exchange, Ethan realized that though he had spent his life mastering control, he had never felt so deeply the weight of powerlessness as he did in the presence of a barefoot little girl who had nothing left but her tears. Ethan hesitated only a second before slipping the heavy coat from his own shoulders and draping it around the small frame before him, the fabric engulfing her completely, turning her into a fragile figure, wrapped in warmth she hadn't expected. and as he pulled it snug across her back, he felt the faint shiver that came not just from cold, but from fear, begin to soften. He bent low, and without a second thought, slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as carefully as if she were made of glass, her lightness startling him, reminding him how little she must have eaten, how fragile survival could be when love was absent. She stiffened at first, her body tense, but when she realized he wasn't letting go, her tiny hands clutched his shirt front, pressing against him with a desperation that nearly broke him. Each small grip of her fingers said what her voice could not, that she was terrified he too might vanish if she blinked, that this fleeting sense of safety might disappear like all the promises she had once trusted. Ethan carried her across the lot, each step echoing in his ears, not with the sound of shoes against concrete, but with the strange weight of responsibility now anchored to his heart. When he reached the car, he opened the door gently, lowering her into the leather seat, the luxury interior suddenly seeming hollow compared to the fragile treasure it now held. He fastened the seatbelt over her small frame, and for the first time in his life, the click of that buckle felt less like a safety feature and more like a vow. She leaned sideways, still holding his sleeve even as he closed the door, her eyes flickering with fear every time his hand left her grasp, as though disappearing was the trick adults were best at. Sliding into the driver's seat, Ethan started the engine, but this time he barely noticed the purr of its power, because all he could think about was the child's fragile breaths behind him. The drive back was quiet, broken only by the sound of her small hiccuped sobs, each one piercing deeper than any criticism he had ever endured in his career. By the time he pulled into the long driveway of his mansion, the grandeur of the estate, the wide pillars, the gleaming windows, the carefully trimmed hedges, looked foreign to him, like a stage set for a man he no longer fully recognized. Inside, he carried her past marble floors and crystal chandeliers, their shine suddenly meaningless against the weary slump of a child too tired to marvel at anything. He laid her gently on the sofa, pulled a soft blanket across her, and sat for a moment watching her eyes flutter shut, her trust fragile but given anyway, and he felt an ache swell in his chest that refused to leave. That night, long after the house had gone silent, Ethan lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows played across the walls, his mind no longer occupied with mergers, profit margins, or skyscraper deals. Instead, he heard one voice on repeat, fragile and echoing, the kind of voice you don't forget. "Daddy left me." The words threaded through him like a haunting refrain, each repetition loosening the grip of the empire he had built, each syllable asking a question his life had never prepared him to answer. He tossed and turned, sheets tangled, memories of boardrooms and celebrations flashing through his mind, all the times he had congratulated himself on winning, on achieving, on outpacing every competitor. Yet now, lying awake in the dark, he wondered if he had been running toward emptiness all along. What was the meaning of a penthouse vase? IW. If somewhere a barefoot child sat alone in a cold parking lot with no one to claim her. What was the worth of stock options and contracts when compared to the trembling of a 7-year-old clutching his shirt like it was the last safe thing in the world? Ethan pressed a hand to his chest as though trying to still the ache there, and for the first time in years, he admitted to himself that maybe he wasn't as strong as everyone thought. Wealth had built walls around him, but Lily's voice had slipped through every crack, and now he couldn't silence it. He closed his eyes, seeing not numbers but her tear-streaked face, her small hands clinging, her whispered confession of abandonment, and in that sleepless night he realized something terrifying, that the life he had called successful had never actually taught him what success truly meant. The sun spilled softly across the wide windows of the mansion, a light gentler than the harsh boardroom fluorescence Ethan had grown used to, and with morning came the sound he had never expected to hear in his home, small footsteps echoing against marble floors, a rhythm that carried life into the silence. Lily moved cautiously at first, her bare feet padding across the polished stone, her eyes wide at the towering ceilings and long hallways that seemed endless to someone so small. But soon her caution gave way to curiosity, and she began exploring, her tiny fingers brushing along the velvet curtains, her head tilting back to stare at the chandeliers that glittered like captured stars. Ethan watched from a distance, leaning against the doorway, astonished that the same halls he had walked 1,000 times now looked different, warmer, simply because a child's giggles bounced from wall to wall like sunlight turned into sound. She disappeared briefly into the study, and when she returned, her hands clutched a scrap of paper and a pen muck. Too large for her fingers, yet with determination she scribbled uneven lines until they formed a picture. A house with a roof, a stick figure, man beside a small girl with a smile. She carried it to Ethan shyly, holding it up with the earnest pride of someone offering treasure. And when he took it, her eyes lit up, waiting for approval that mattered more to her than any deal he had ever signed. She left more notes as the hours passed, small sketches tucked under his laptop, a smiley face on a napkin beside his coffee, and once, a simple message written in crooked letters. "Thank you, Mr. Ethan." The title made him pause, because in that word Mr. he felt both distance and closeness, a child's respect wrapped around her trust. It was not father, not yet, but it was something real, something freely given, and it carried a weight greater than the applause of investors. Slowly, as the day stretched forward, Ethan felt his lips curve into smiles he hadn't practiced, smiles that weren't meant for photo ops or interviews, but were born from watching Lily skip down the hall, her laughter bright and unguarded. He realized he had been measuring joy in the wrong currency all along. It was not in profits, stacked neatly in accounts, or the sleek lines of his luxury cars parked silently outside, but in the way Lily twirled in the foyer, her arms spread wide, as if the echo of her own giggles were music enough to dance to. She found a piano in one of the unused rooms and pressed random keys, the uneven notes clashing and tumbling. But to Ethan, it was the sweetest sound, because it was the sound of life-filling spaces that had been cold for years. He caught himself setting aside his phone just to listen, ignoring emails that once commanded his full attention, watching instead as she hummed tunelessly to herself. Each moment with her felt like the undoing of years of hardness, the slow crumbling of a fortress he had built around himself. She looked at him differently too, not as the city did, not as a man of wealth or reputation, but as someone who had shown her warmth when the world had turned its back. And in her eyes, that trust was pure, uncalculated, untainted by anything but honesty. And Ethan found himself protecting it fiercely. At lunch, when she perched on the chair too big for her, swinging her legs while eating more eagerly than he had ever seen a child eat, she looked up and said between bites, "You're funny, Mr. Ethan." And he laughed, genuinely laughed, not the polite chuckle reserved for colleagues, but a sound that surprised even him, filling the dining hall in a way chandeliers never could. By evening, the mansion was no longer the hollow symbol of success it had once been, but a place touched by crayons, giggles, and the fragile yet powerful bond of two souls learning to trust one another. And as Ethan watched Lily curl up on the sofa with a blanket she had claimed as her own, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was smiling, not for wealth, not for recognition, but because a little girl who had been abandoned by the world had chosen to believe in him. The days of laughter and warmth with Lily had barely begun to mend Ethan's once hardened heart when reality came knocking in the form of child services, their presence a reminder that his bond with her, as deep as it felt, was not yet secure in the eyes of the law, and when they suggested placing her in foster care, a sharp ache gripped him, deeper than any business loss he had ever endured, because the thought of her small frame disappearing from the halls that had only just begun to echo with joy left him breathless. He attended every meeting they scheduled, his polished confidence faltering each time papers were slid across the table, documents filled with cold lines that measured lives in technicalities, not in love. And though he signed what was required, his chest tightened with fear that signatures and stamps might undo the fragile happiness they had found together. At last, the matter reached the courthouse, a place where Ethan was accustomed to being in control. After all, he had stood before investors, government officials and corporate boards without flinching. But that morning, as he stood before the judge, his palms were damp and his voice trembled, betraying a vulnerability he had never dared show. The courtroom air was heavy, filled with murmurs, the shuffling of papers, and the weight of decisions that could change lives forever. And at the center of it all was Lily, her small hand clasped tightly in his, her eyes wide with fear that she might be torn from the only stability she had known since being left behind. When the judge asked him to speak, Ethan's chest tightened, and for the first time in years, his carefully crafted armor of composure cracked, his words emerging not as rehearsed lines, but as raw truth. "I may not be her father by blood, but I will love her as my own. Please, let me give her the life she deserves." The courtroom grew still, and in that silence his words hung heavy, breaking through the formality of legal procedure with the force of sincerity, a declaration that no contract or fortune could match. Lily clung to him then, her tiny fingers wrapping around his hand as if it were her lifeline, her lips trembling before she whispered the words that shattered every heart in the room. "Please don't leave me." The plea was so soft it almost vanished into the air, yet it carried more weight than any testimony. And when Ethan looked down at her, his throat burned with emotion, his grip tightening to assure her that he had no intention of letting go. For once, he was not the CEO with a reputation to protect, but simply a man fighting for a child who had given him purpose. And the vulnerability in his stance made the people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably, many realizing they were witnessing something rare, love born not of obligation, but of choice. The judge leaned back, studying the man who had everything yet stood trembling for the sake of a child with nothing, and though no verdict was spoken in that moment, Ethan felt the power of his own transformation, knowing that whether the law agreed or not, his heart had already claimed her as his daughter. Weeks passed, and the papers that once threatened to separate them now bore the signature that bound them together, granting Ethan official guardianship of Lily, a title that seemed far too small to capture the enormity of what she had become to him, yet one that filled him with pride greater than any accolade he had ever achieved. His name, once whispered in business circles as a symbol of ruthless ambition and towering wealth, began to carry a new weight, not because of another skyscraper bearing his company's logo, but because of the story that quietly spread about the man who chose love over convenience, compassion over coldness, and a child over his solitude. At home, the mansion itself seemed transformed. Where once its walls stood lifeless, they now carried warmth, painted with the sound of Lily's laughter, her small voice echoing as she sang to herself in the hallways, her drawings pinned proudly to places that once displayed expensive art. Every evening, Ethan found himself walking through the garden with her, his hand engulfing hers, the grass beneath their feet soft, the air filled with the scent of flowers that now seemed brighter, simply because she was there to notice them. Lily would point to butterflies and chase them with delight, tugging him along, her tiny shoes leaving playful trails along the stone paths. And Ethan, who once only saw gardens as property value, now saw them as a stage for her joy, a place where childhood could finally bloom. Each step with her reminded him that true wealth had never been in his accounts, his investments, or the silent grandeur of his estate. It lived in the fragile grip of her fingers around his own, in the trust that she had given him so freely, in the way her smile erased years of loneliness from his heart. He began to measure success differently, not in stock charts, but in bedtime stories, in the way she drifted off to sleep beside the comfort of knowing she was safe, in the whispered, "Good night, Mr. Ethan," that soon softened into, "Good night, Dad." The boardrooms still called for him, the city still marveled at his empire. But those things no longer defined him. What defined him was the child who had once been left with nothing, now skipping through gardens that echoed with promises of a future built not on contracts, but on love. He often thought back to that night in the lonely parking lot, to the small figure huddled beneath the lamppost, and he realized it was not only her life that had been rescued. It was his. For years he had built walls so high no one could reach him, but Lily had walked straight through them with nothing more than her innocence and her need for love. And in giving her what she had been denied, she gave him what he never knew he needed. The day he found her was no accident. It was the turning point fate had chosen for him, the moment where fortune was redefined, and as the seasons shifted, Ethan understood that this, her laughter, her trust, her presence, was the truest empire he could ever build. He didn't just save Lily, she saved him too, and together they stepped into a future where every sunrise promised not wealth, not power, but something infinitely greater: family.